Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be back in my favorite city. I am not even a closet White Sox fan. I'm a real White Sox fan. I know there might be some Cub fans here, too, so that's fine. Anyway, it's so good to be back here. Thank you to the Chicago Humanities Festival for inviting me, and in particular for your choice of Adam Jentleson to talk about his book. And of course, as so happens these days with all the crazy things going on in the world, it's particularly relevant given the events of this, I guess it's still the same week, when this jarring occurrence happened with regard to the Supreme Court. Just a second before I get into the merits of what this wonderful book is about, Adam and I share a great affection for the late Senator Harry Reid, who was one of my favorite colleagues, and Adam was a great staff member for him. I want to just say that when I first met him, I didn't think he seemed like a senator. I thought he seemed more like an undertaker, actually. I thought, how did this guy ever get elected to the United States Senate? Which is, I imagine people said about me too. But it turns out that he was actually a fascinating, principled, very effective guy. But he also, what people don't always know, he had a sense of humor, and there wasn't a lot of that in the Senate. So he used to get irritated that I would come down at him and, read some of my speeches because I couldn't prepare everything ad lib. So one time I put my notes on my desk, and I went to the restroom, came back, and they were gone. Harry had thrown them in the garbage. Not so they couldn't be retrieved, but he was kind of a practical joker, but I think we both miss him, and so much of this is about our feelings about that. This book that Adam has written is truly readable, but very carefully researched. It's not easy to make the filibuster, which is one of the most archaic things in the world, to make it interesting, but this is fascinating. And look, I didn't know as much about the filibuster as you would have thought I would after 18 years. I really learned more about it when I was teaching at law schools across the country, where I was teaching about the Senate. So I thought I was kind of a big expert on it until I read this book. I learned a whole bunch of new stuff that I think is very important in terms of the history and the reality of it. And who would know that at this critical point in our history that the filibuster would be at the fulcrum of our future? This is something that has come to reality in recent weeks and recent months, and Adam's book is perfectly timed. This also gives me an opportunity to slip in some war stories of mine, but I'll put it in the form of a question. It'll be relevant. But let's kick it off, Adam, by having you explain what some might call the central myth of the Senate. And that's something I experienced as a 39-year-old new senator. Some of the older senior senators were very cordial, and they came over and they put their arms around me, and they said, we're going to really enjoy it here. And Russ, this isn't the House. This is the Senate. We are the cooling saucer that, as he said, Washington told Jefferson. What's this all about, Adam?
So thank you, Senator Feingold, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's really a thrill to get to talk about this today on such a crazy week, and it really is truly hard to imagine that it's still the same week. So the cooling saucer. So this is one of my favorite myths to debunk about the Senate and about the filibuster specifically. As Russ, you said, this is something that if you know one thing about the Senate, you probably have heard that it is supposed to be the cooling saucer. And the first thing to know about this myth of Washington explaining the Senate in this way to Jefferson is that it almost certainly never happened. It is an apocryphal story that seemed to first appear in Harper's Weekly sometime in the late 19th century, long after Washington and Jefferson had passed from the earth by a reporter who was too young to have been there at any time when they were alive. But it almost certainly never happened. But it's sticky, and it's stuck around because it does seem to resonate with people's perception of the role of the Senate in our system of government. But the other thing to know about it is that at the time that it appeared and sort of became this foundational myth, it was not being used in reference to the filibuster, because as late as the end of the 19th century, and frankly well into the 20th century, the filibuster was still an extremely rare occurrence in the Senate and had only sort of recently come into existence. So it probably never happened, and if it did happen, and even as an anecdote, it had nothing to do with the filibuster. The idea of the Senate as a cooling saucer is true, but it has nothing to do with the filibuster. The Senate was created to act as a counterweight to the House of Representatives, but the way that it was supposed to exert this cooling influence was through structural aspects of the Senate that cause it to be different from the House. And so specifically, that is the fact that senators are elected for 6-year terms, which are supposed to make them less susceptible to the whims of public opinion. They are elected by a statewide electorate, as opposed to a district, so a bigger, broader audience that they're accountable to. And the Senate, there were age limits at the time that probably matter less now, but the Senate was also, every 2-year cycle, every single seat in the House of Representatives is up for re-election, and so you can have huge swings depending on the political environment at the time. In the Senate, only 1/3 of the body is ever up for election in any given 2-year cycle. So all of these things together were supposed to make the Senate less susceptible to the whims of public opinion than the House of Representatives. So that was the way it was supposed to be a cooling saucer. And all of those things still exist and would still exist if the filibuster was gotten rid of today. So to the extent there's some truth to the anecdote and the Senate was supposed to play this role, it had nothing to do with the filibuster, and all of the ways in which it was supposed to exert this influence would still exist if the filibuster disappeared tomorrow.
Yeah, and supposedly that this myth is based on the idea that Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention. He was in France. So he comes back and he supposedly says to Washington, what is this thing? And I guess it was based on the idea that in those days, if the tea was too hot, you'd pour it in the saucer and then drink it out of a saucer. So this is where this myth comes from. But as Adam has pointed out, here's the Constitution. You won't find the word filibuster anywhere in this thing. And in fact, the term, as your book beautifully illustrates, really doesn't come into being for a very long time. But it blew my mind, having some of the things I didn't know, is that in Lyndon Johnson's maiden speech, as you point out, in the Senate, he's talking about this filibuster as being foundational, as if this is what James Madison was debating with Alexander Hamilton all these years ago. So maybe what you could do for us is give kind of the elevator explanation, and you can use the Willis Tower elevator because it's a little convoluted, but how does the filibuster work?
So just to ground this, it might be up and down a few times in the tower, to ground it in sort of the environment that existed when the Constitution was written and ratified. There was no conception that the filibuster should ever come into existence. It's not in the Constitution. It was not discussed at the Constitutional Convention. The only way in which it was discussed was for the framers to make it very clear that they didn't want anything like the filibuster as we know it today to ever exist. There is no word filibuster in the Constitution. There is no word filibuster in the notes of the Constitutional Convention because the term itself didn't even come into existence until about the 1850s. But what was discussed was the question of whether there should be a supermajority threshold in the United States Senate to pass bills. And the overwhelming verdict was no. And the reason that this was sort of an area of focus for the framers was that they had had very recent experience with what a legislature looks like when you do put a supermajority threshold in place. And by supermajority, I mean technically anything above a majority, but typically it's in the realm of 3/5 or 2/3 of the body to pass. So the reason they were sort of zeroed in on this concept was that in the Articles of Confederation, American Government 1.0, there had been a supermajority threshold. And they put it there for all of the reasons that people claim the filibuster is a good thing today, for those who claim that. They put it in place in the Articles of Confederation because they thought having to get a supermajority for important pieces of legislation would promote compromise and consensus and lead to consensus-based governance. What they found instead was that the complete opposite happened. And having a supermajority threshold in place under the Articles of Confederation led to gridlock, chaos, and poor governance. And so when they went to write the Constitution, they had said, well, we tried this for good reasons. It did not work, and we do not want that to be in place in this new system of government. So that was how they wrote the rules of the Senate. That was how it operated for a good 50 years. And I think it's then there's this question of unlimited debate, which people today claim the filibuster serves to uphold. So that raises the question, did they believe in unlimited debate? So maybe they didn't believe in supermajority thresholds at the Constitutional Convention, but maybe they did believe in unlimited debate. They didn't believe in that either. And to an extent that I was actually surprised by when I started to do the research for the book. I thought it was going to be a closer call. But there was a very clear sense that the way the Senate should operate was senators should be allowed to talk as much as they wanted, as long as they kept the discussion focused on the issue at hand. And if a senator was, discussing the bill that was being debated that day, by all means, they could talk as long as they wanted. But if they then started to talk in a manner that was exclusively obstructionist and aimed at throwing sand in the gears or delaying their other colleagues from talking, that was unheard of. And there were many ways in the original Senate that you could shut down a senator who started to speak in this obstructive manner. Some of them were actual rules, but others were sort of just getting up and talking or starting to cough loudly. Literally in the manual that Jefferson wrote sort of, to govern the conduct of senators, they talked about, people starting to cough and talk over senators who were being obstructive. So it was considered unsenatorial behavior to try to block a bill or prevent your colleagues from proceeding with the business of the day by talking for a long time. So yes, unlimited debate, but only as long as it remained focused. And when it came to obstruction, absolutely not. So this was not just sort of, the way the Senate operated in the first couple years. This was how it operated for a good half century after the founding of the nation. And there was simply accepted that this is the way it would be.
So kind of like how they do in the House of Commons, using various techniques to encourage people to be quiet.
That's right. It's, if they wanted you to be quiet, you would know, and you would be quiet.
So how did this legislative body, unlike almost any other one in the world, end up with a rule that allows unlimited debate? I had a chance to meet a guy who was the clerk, they would say in England, of the House of Lords. And I was teaching about the rules of the Senate here, and I said, what rules did you have in the House of Lords? He said, well, we didn't really have any. We just thought people might act like adults, which is really what you're saying, because these people were very aware of the traditions of the House of Lords in creating the second body. So, as I remember, Thomas Jefferson had a little passage in his little rule book that he wrote while I was presiding over the Senate, where he said that this motion for the previous question, getting a little nerdy here, but this is the key. A motion for the previous question in any legislative body means we've heard enough, let's vote. He basically said you can only use that in very limited circumstances, when it's impugning the reputation of somebody. But Adam is onto something here by pointing out that was in a context where they just really wouldn't do that. So tell the story, and this gets pretty fun because it involves Aaron Burr after he killed Hamilton.
Yes, that's right. So Aaron Burr, his last contribution to American history after murdering Alexander Hamilton was to open the door for the filibuster as we know it today to exist by accident. So thank you, Aaron Burr. What happened was in 1806, the United States Senate had just finished conducting an impeachment trial. This was the third impeachment trial in American history, but the first one that was very fraught. The first two were sort of for obvious reasons and they were easy calls. This was the impeachment of Samuel Chase for the question of was he too partisan, and can you be impeached for being too partisan, which was a more difficult question to solve. And so the Senate conducted this trial. It was a big test for this institution, right? Can it conduct this trial in a way that gives people confidence that it's being done fairly? And Aaron Burr was vice president, and he presided over the Senate and presided over this trial. And they succeeded. They passed the test. They conducted the trial in a way that was viewed as fair to all sides, and Aaron Burr received a lot of credit, even though he had just shot Alexander Hamilton, for overseeing the conduct of the trial. And one of the things that Aaron Burr noticed during the conduct of the trial was that the Senate rule books were very confusing, and rules were written down in different places. And if you were in a position like he was, and you had to sort of, govern the rules of this institution, it was just hard to know what those rules were as a matter of sort of simple reference. And so at the end of this trial, he made a series of recommendations to the Senate that they should clean up and streamline their rule books, essentially. In the process, one of the things he recommended that they get rid of was this previous question motion, which has evolved in legislative bodies, as Russ said, to be the way in which you call up a vote on a majority rule basis. What's important to understand is that he didn't get rid of it because he said, I now want the Senate to be able to have unlimited debate and not be able to call up majority votes. He got rid of it because nobody ever used it. It was not necessary at the time because the culture that we've just been discussing here prevailed. It was unheard of for senators to try to obstruct each other. There were a couple filibusters in the first 50 years, but we know about them because they were so extraordinarily rare that people freaked out and thought, that this was an aberration. So they got rid of it because no one ever used it, and it wasn't seen as a shock to the system. It wasn't seen as a major deviation at the time because for several decades after 1806, when they got rid of this rule, people continued to abide by the norms and the guardrails of the time, and continued to not filibuster, and continued to have every vote in the Senate be a majority rule vote. And that's actually one point I just want to underscore here, which is that when I talk about this and I say this is the way it used to be, as a fact basis for that claim, every single vote in the United States Senate from the founding all the way up into about the middle of the 20th century was at a majority rule basis. It just was, because there was no filibuster and there was no supermajority threshold. That the only exceptions to that are the things that are enumerated in the Constitution as supermajority thresholds, like impeachment or constitutional amendments. But as far as regular order business was concerned, every single vote was majority rule, all through the 19th century and well into the 20th. And so they got rid of this rule. Nobody thought much of it. They proceeded to operate as they had for since the founding, with limited debate, majority rule votes, and that was just the way it was.
If you read this book, there's just marvelous history of how we got to where we are now, particularly the portrayals of the role of John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Richard Russell of Georgia, and Jesse Helms of North Carolina. These are all really interesting things, but let's zoom up to basically now, Adam. What is it that is really wrong with the filibuster? Is it inherent in the filibuster idea, or is it the way it's being used now?
So what's wrong with the filibuster now is that it has created an environment where every single vote that comes before the Senate has to be a supermajority threshold. And what that does is it allows the numerical minority in the Senate to block anything it wants to, effectively. And that creates an incentive structure where blocking things is rewarded much more than passing things is rewarded. And there's many other things that are going on in our political culture and our society writ large that have sort of supercharged those incentives. But there's only so much in the Senate you can do to deal with those larger forces at work. But what those forces mean for the Senate itself is that people have seized on that ability to block and obstruct and used it to sort of vault themselves to prominence. I think often of the example of Senator Ted Cruz, who came into the Senate as a freshman senator, proceeded to virtually single-handedly drive the United States government into a government shutdown in the year 2013 by blocking the funding of Obamacare through the appropriations process. And it was a horrible experience. Republican leaders at the time didn't want to do it, but Cruz was able to sort of manipulate this incentive structure that rewarded obstruction and rewarded grandstanding to drive the government into a shutdown. And politically, if you look at it from his perspective, it's hard to argue with what he was able to achieve for himself by doing that, just from a cynical perspective. He became a national figure. He raised a tremendous amount of money. He came in second in his party's nomination process in the next nominating cycle. So if you look at it in terms of results, it worked for the purposes that he wanted it to work. So but the question is it inherent in the filibuster? I believe it's inherent in the supermajority threshold, and we can talk more about how we got from the talking filibuster to the supermajority threshold. I think if you go back to something more like what people think of when they think of the filibuster, the sort of Jimmy Stewart style, where you have to actually talk on the Senate floor, then there's less wrong with that. And it's a lot of what we discuss in the book is how we got from that talking filibuster, which is what most Americans think of, I think, when they think of the filibuster, to a situation where nobody's talking on the Senate floor, but every vote is forced to overcome this supermajority threshold, which is basically the worst of both worlds. To the extent the filibuster was supposed to promote debate and supposed to give the minority an opportunity to have their say, now you've got none of that, but the minority is allowed to obstruct the minority and force everything to overcome a supermajority threshold.
Adam, the theme for the Chicago Humanities Festival this year is the word public. It seems that the filibuster practice, as well as the practice of holds, which you discuss in your book as well, it's not like you can call up the Senate and say, hey, what's being filibustered right now? It's really kind of in a haze and not accessible, isn't that right?
Yeah, it's a very closed process, and it's indecipherable even to many people who work there. And this is why we've had a lot more power get concentrated in the leadership of the United States Senate. The Senate was originally conceived of as a body where there should not be vertical control. The Speaker of the House is a position that was created by the Constitution. So there's always been a Speaker of the House. It was a big body. There was a perception that you would always need some sort of strong leadership there. But in the Senate, the positions of majority and minority leader didn't exist until the 1920s. And the body was expected to sort of be able to govern itself through negotiation. But the fact that it's so Byzantine today means that many senators don't really know what's going on, and they rely on leadership to give them a schedule and say, you have to be here at this time to vote, and this is what we're voting on, this is how you should vote, and all those things, which has just led to a super concentration of power and leadership, which I think is bad for the institution. But it's another function of this shift from the talking filibuster to the silent filibuster, where throughout, as the filibuster did start to come into existence in the middle of the 19th century, everybody knew what was being filibustered because people had to physically be on the floor of the Senate talking about it. So there was no way to not know. And if you believe that served a purpose, which I can see the argument for, you were having a debate, you were discussing big, high-profile, difficult, controversial issues in full view of the public, allowing the public to hear the arguments from both sides. So, the transition from a talking filibuster to the silent filibuster has also helped create this level of secrecy and this sort of smokescreen over the everyday operations of the Senate, which are very hard for the public to understand.
And in this regard, I think, in recent years, people certainly have become more aware of the word filibuster. I mean, maybe people always had some idea of it, but another word that most people had no idea about was cloture. And I love the part in your book where your chapter begins with this whole issue of cloture began with a guy named Fighting Bob. That's because I'm a cheesehead. And only behind Bart Starr, Brett Favre, and Aaron Rodgers is Fighting Bob. So yes, we think of this as being a horrible thing, harming voting rights and Jim Crow and all of that, but it was La Follette who caused some of this, and he was by no means a racist Jim Crow guy.
That's right. Fighting Bob La Follette was a populist senator from Wisconsin at the turn of the century, and it was a filibuster that he led in 1918 against the effort to enter World War I. There was, President Wilson had a bill to arm American merchant ships that he put before the Senate. La Follette saw that as a backdoor way to enter World War I, which he was not wrong about. But the public was very much on the side of doing this, and even if it meant increased militancy. And so what happened with that filibuster was, for obscure reasons relating to the Senate calendar, he only had to filibuster it for 3 days before the Senate adjourned, and the bill died. So he succeeded in this 3-day filibuster, and what happened was a massive public outcry and backlash against this effort to obstruct this ship arming bill. And that gave reformers, led by Wilson, the sort of political capital that they needed to implement a reform in the Senate to curb the use of the filibuster. And it is ironic that, it's certainly true that both sides use the filibuster. However, it is also true that it was overwhelmingly used for the purpose of blocking civil rights, especially as we got into the 20th century during the Jim Crow era. It was identified, almost hand in glove with the purpose of maintaining white supremacy and blocking civil rights during this period. So there's some irony to the fact that it was a progressive who really stepped in it and caused this massive backlash that led to reform. But what's important about that is this is where the supermajority threshold comes into being. Up to 1918, as we discussed before, every vote was majority threshold. If you filibustered, you had to physically, occupy the floor. You could work with colleagues. You could pass batons back and forth, so it didn't have to just be one person talking, but you had to put in the time and effort to organize that and to physically be there. And once you stopped, your opponents could just bring up the bill for a majority vote. Which also, by the way, means that most things didn't get filibustered because it was hard to do. It was physically trying and caused a lot of coordination, so only really big issues would ever run into the filibuster, and even then it was very rare. What they did in response to Fighting Bob was to create a rule that was an attempt to go back to this previous question rule that we discussed. And the previous question, as Russ said, was any member could stand up and say, okay, we've had enough, I call the previous question, let's have a vote on this bill. And the vote would pop up at a majority vote. What they did in 1918 was try to basically put that rule back on the books. This is the rule that Aaron Burr got rid of. And so they created a committee, and the committee devised a rule that was their best attempt to recreate that rule and put it back on the books. A majority of the committee wanted to set the threshold for what the previous question would be at a majority vote where it had been previously. But because they couldn't reach consensus on the committee devising the rule, the plan B was a supermajority threshold. And this was not in any way designed to say a supermajority threshold should be the de facto threshold for passage. This was to say, look, in the extraordinary circumstance in the Senate of 1918, where filibustering is still very rare, in the extraordinary circumstance that you can't get a senator to shut up after they've had some time, after weeks, maybe even months, if you can't get them to shut up, then you have this tool at your disposal, which will allow senators to come together who might be on both sides of the issue, but can come together on the principle that it's time to wrap up this debate and move on. And you can implement that through this rule called cloture, which you can also think of as closure, because that is what they used to call it. So bringing closure to the debate. And so if a filibuster is going on and it's in contradiction to public opinion like Fighting Bob's was, 2/3 of the body can come together, get closure on the debate. In Senate terms, closure means you still have 3 more days to talk. And you can move on. So that was the rule in 1918. They set it as supermajority threshold. It was still very rare up until the middle of the century or so.
So one thing that's puzzled me, when I was elected to the Senate in 1992, the weekend before I got on the plane, went to Washington, I sat down and watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And I'd seen it before, but how moving and wonderful. And how is it that, because the Frank Capra film was before a lot of this civil rights stuff was going on. It was after the creation of Cloture. Where did this come from? It's really a film question. It's like, why was it being lionized?
Well, it's especially ironic because the movie is based on a true story of a senator from the Pacific Northwest uncovering corruption as it happened in the movie. In real life, the filibuster had nothing to do with the story of how this corruption was uncovered and how it was stopped. In real life, it was done through investigations and congressional hearings and sort of less dramatic, but more, less dramatic means. But Frank Capra needed a way, something more dramatic, to demonstrate, this idea of the little guy standing up to the big guy. And so he used the filibuster to do that. But it is ironic because although this was not, pre-civil rights movement, there were civil rights bills that were moving their way through Congress. And from the creation of Cloture in 1918 up until the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the only category of legislation that was consistently forced to clear that cloture threshold, that supermajority threshold, the only category of legislation that was subjected to supermajority were civil rights bills. And so at the time, these were anti-lynching bills, bills to end poll taxes, and bills to end employment discrimination that were advanced actually at the time more by the Republican Party, which was still back then the party of Lincoln. So Frank Capra took this dramatic tactic, glorified it, even though when this movie came out in the 1930s, the only type of legislation that was ever having to really run into this thing were civil rights bills. So
really interesting.
There's a sleight of hand and some directorial, creativity there, but that's
a huge
how we
impact,
got this myth. That's right.
We have not a lot of time left, so I'm going to combine two big questions, and maybe the people bring out more in their questions from the floor. So we were just talking about people giving speeches like Jimmy Stewart. That's not what happens now. And secondly, people say, "Whoa, don't get rid of that filibuster because then you won't have any bipartisanship." Can you take those two on?
Yeah, I think if you are somebody who's a civic-minded person and you would like to see the United States Senate go back to being a place where there is debate on the Senate floor and more bipartisanship, being in favor of reforming the filibuster is one of the best things you can do to try to restore the Senate to that kind of working institution. And it might seem counterintuitive, but here's the reason. It goes back to the framers. And the framers, when they saw how this worked in the Articles of Confederation, they identified the fact that the supermajority threshold creates these perverse incentives. They saw it at the time. I'm obviously not somebody who thinks the framers were right about everything. They were very wrong about lots of things, but they were absolutely prophetic in their prediction of what happens when you create this supermajority threshold. And all of the other dysfunction of the Senate is kind of downstream from there. So the reason nobody's speaking on the Senate floor, if you flip on C-SPAN 2 on any day that the Senate is session, you will see probably a blank screen that says quorum call. Or if somebody is giving a speech, they're reading from a piece of paper that their staff probably handed them minutes before they walked in, no offense, to an entirely empty chamber where nobody's listening to them. You do it for many reasons. You want to get an issue on the record, but you're not trying to persuade anybody. And if you were, you'd be doing a bad job because your colleagues would not be there listening to you. Nobody would be hearing you. It's kind of a sad state of affairs. If you got rid of the filibuster in the way it exists today, the supermajority threshold, and returned to something like the talking filibuster, people would have to be there. So when you're on the floor giving a speech, your colleagues would physically be there with you, listening to you, because as soon as you were done, they would jump at the opportunity to hold the vote. So you would have, so much of what's wrong with the Senate today, I think, stems from the fact that people are not physically together anymore. Senators from different parties barely see each other in the course of a Senate week. They don't eat lunch together, and they never see each other on the Senate floor. So you need to get people back on the floor where debate is a live wire, where things are happening and there's some consequence to it. I think that would also lead to actual extemporaneous debate where they weren't just reading off a script all the time because they'd be having open exchanges. And then to the second part of the question, I think that you need to have more legislative action happening to create the opportunity for bipartisanship. In a gridlocked Senate, there's no bipartisanship because there's nothing getting done at all. And what you saw with the filibuster before it sort of came into existence was that when things were passing on majority rule votes, they would often become bipartisan as soon as it became clear that the side that wanted to pass something had a majority. So we look back at things like Medicare, for instance, which, by the way, I mentioned that civil rights were the only things facing the supermajority threshold. Everything that passed with the New Deal and the Great Society, anything you associate with that era passed the Senate on a majority vote. It was not filibustered. It did not have to clear a supermajority. It passed on a majority vote. When you look at the vote totals are often 60, 70. But what usually happened was that those bills would be fought tooth and nail by the forces opposing them until the forces behind the bills produced a majority. Then, once they produced a majority, a bunch of people would jump on board. Maybe they would get changes made at the last minute. They wanted to have skin in the game. Maybe they realized it was a popular thing that was passing, and they just wanted credit. The best example of this is Medicare, where for years, people fought to pass Medicare or something like it. It was fought tooth and nail in the 60s at the time. But there's a memo that I talk about in the book from LBJ's chief legislative affairs officer to the president saying, we did it. We got a majority for Medicare. It's going to pass. And the fight was to get that majority. Once they got that majority, a bunch of people jumped on board. And the vote total was 67 or something like that. But, and so, for bipartisanship to happen, legislating needs to happen. And that's why if you go back to a majority rule threshold, more things would happen. And I'm not saying this would happen immediately. The last 2 years, certainly, you haven't seen that, even though you've seen some things pass on a majority rule basis. But I think over time, if you're on the other side, the option of just sort of sitting on your hands and preventing the other side from doing anything would go away. So your only option would be to either be a part of what was happening or to just be completely irrelevant. And I think the incentive there draws people towards the legislative process.
Let me just ask one more quick question, and then we'll go to Q&A, I want to assure you. So he has in here some great ideas at the end about how to fix this thing. If you could just do a couple minutes on it. I wouldn't recommend what they did to Fighting Bob, who was giving one of these very long speeches, and he was eating a turkey sandwich and some eggnog. And I was jealous because we weren't allowed to eat on the Senate floor. But they poisoned him. And he survived, and he kept talking because he was a tough son of a gun. But just quickly, so we can go to Q&A, what are some ideas?
Yeah, I think the key thing is to get rid of the supermajority threshold. I think you have to do away with that. And then, but we should do away with it with a suite of other reforms that I lay out in the book that would incentivize senators to come to the floor and incentivize debate. I think you have to create restore the Senate to being a place where everybody's free to have their say, and that is something that will always make it different from the House. If the minority wants to discuss a bill for 3 weeks, a month, have at it. They're more than welcome to. And if they want to use that public platform to convince the public that their side is right, go for it. But at a certain point, you have to have the opportunity for that bill to pop up for a majority rule vote. I also think there are things I discuss in the book, right? I think the centralized power and leadership has been an unfortunate side effect of this. I think there are things we can do to democratize the body and make it easy for a senator to call up a vote on whatever bill they've been working on. That was the way it was supposed to be. And I think we need more transparency. I think we need to get rid of secret holds, which they sort of did, but it didn't really work. They found a way to get around it. We need to open up the institution of sunlight so that if you do turn on C-SPAN 2, you know what's going on. You'll know what's being debated, you'll know the status of it, and it won't be so Byzantine and hard to understand.
Terrific stuff. Let's go to audience question and answer.
Hey everybody, good evening.
Somebody's going to come around and...
Yep, we're coming around. If you could please raise your hand if you have a question. We're going to try and keep it short and keep it concise. Awesome. We'll start with you right here.
So thank you both. I've learned a lot today. But what I wanted to ask was Biden's Build Back Better plan, kind of investing in America. Would you consider that economically viable, and why do you believe so many senators are opposed to it?
I do, but don't take my word for it. I'm not an economist. But and it's split basically 52, 48, depending on the content. But I'm actually going to take the question in a slightly different direction. My answer is yes, I do think it's viable. But I'll sort of use it as a springboard to say, I think it's a good example of where this legislative process could have been better if we'd had different rules, where because of this process called reconciliation that I will not bore you with in trying to explain, it is a way to do an end run around the filibuster. It was only supposed to be used for sort of narrowly budgetary items. Because people are desperate to pass things, it's been exploited for a lot of other topics of legislation. But because of the obscure rules, you only get like 2 shots at it in any given 2-year period. So you have to cram everything into this one bill that can pass at a majority rule vote. And that is, in my opinion, the fundamental reason why it hasn't passed yet and might not pass this year, is because you had to create this omnibus bill ranging across a million different subjects, which is another destructive trend in the Senate, which is it's a trend away from individual bills that are discussed and debated on their own merits with hearings and lots of public accountability, to these giant omnibus packages that are a lobbyist's dream because they're 1,000 pages long. It's really easy to slip things in, and the price tag runs up into the trillions. So if you had, the substance of Build Back Better in a Senate that was a majority rule Senate, rather than having it all get wrapped up into one giant 1.5, whatever the price tag is at now, you would have had individual bills on specific topics like climate change, like childcare tax credits, and those bills would have moved on their own with committee hearings, with expert testimony, and then been voted up or down on a majority rule basis, which I think is a much saner way to run a democracy. So that's my opinion of Build Back Better is, I think it'd be good for the economy, but mostly as a Senate procedure nerd, I wish it could have been broken up into smaller bills in a majority rule Senate.
We have a question here on the left.
Hi, thank you so much to both of you. Do you think that the committee structure system prevents the senators from ever really getting to the general body floor because there's so many committees that they serve on? And if the legislation has to go through the committee process, can they ever really act in the time frame that gets the stuff done when it's needed, as opposed to 7 years from now when they finally finish with their hearings?
Well, if you ask the leadership, they would say the committees are a big, pain. If you ask rank and file senators, they would say committees are the heart and soul of the Senate. I think that it could happen that way, but if you're the chair of a committee, there's a lot of incentive to move a bill in a timely fashion, because this is going to be a legacy piece for you as a senator. This would be an issue you've been working on your whole career. You're pretty genuinely committed to the substance. Different committee chairs had different levels of efficiency, depending on the person. But I'm generally in favor of the committee system, and I think, taking power away from leadership and reinvesting it more in committees would be a way to go. And what you have instead is things. Leadership writes all the bills now, effectively, and it's an ad hoc process that operates almost entirely behind closed doors, and is not necessarily that efficient either, because when you're negotiating something as big as a $1.5 trillion package that touches on every aspect of public policy, it's whack-a-mole, and it's really hard to pull together something like that. So. It has its advantages and disadvantages, but on the whole, I think it's a good way to sort of delegate power and expertise throughout the institution that could produce good results.
Oh, thank you. We've got a question on the right over here.
Does the filibuster prevent its own demise?
Yes, you can't. That's a really good question.
So then what?
Well, So technically, to get rid of the filibuster, you have to pass a new rule in the Senate, which requires a supermajority threshold. It's a very catch-22 situation. But what happened over the course of about 40 years was senators devised an alternative method where they could do it on a majority vote. So the Senate is governed by rules, norms, and precedents. It's the sort of the three-legged stool of the Senate. And so Republicans actually contributed a lot to develop. This is what we refer to as the nuclear option, where you change the rules through a majority vote. It has sort of been consigned to the fog of memory, but in 2005, the George W. Bush administration wanted to get rid of the filibuster in order to pass judicial nominees. And the majority leader at the time for Republicans was a guy named Bill Frist from Tennessee, who was a very friendly face, but had only been in the Senate one term and didn't really know what he was doing. So the real power behind the throne at the time was the number 2 leader in the Republican leadership, a guy named Mitch McConnell. And so when George Bush wanted to get rid of the filibuster, the guy he turned to orchestrate the rules fight for him was Mitch McConnell. And so, if you go back to 2005, you can find footage of Mitch McConnell giving a speech on the Senate floor explaining why it was well within the constitutional norms to get rid of the Senate. And one of the things they contributed at the time was helping develop this theory for how you could get rid of the filibuster with a majority rule vote. And so when I was in the Senate in 2013, when we got rid of the filibuster for many categories of nominations, we used the precedent that Republicans had helped develop in 2005 and Bill Douster, who used to work for Russ, wrote a law review article for the NYU Law Review outlining the theory of the case that had a lot of, was indebted to the Republicans' work in 2005. So it's a yes and no question. It does prevent its own demise, but sort of people have gotten creative about figuring out a way to do it through majority rule. So if you wanted to do it today, the short answer is a majority of the Senate could vote to get rid of it.
Let me put a point on that. So this week, Schumer's going to bring up a bill to protect a woman's right to choose in this nation. It will not break a filibuster, and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski can make up for the two Democrats who might not do it, and it could be done this week. So this is the reality. This is what this book's all about.
That's right. And the principle behind that is that the Senate is designed to do whatever a majority of the body wants to do. That's sort of the overriding principle on any rule that was written. It's supposed to be deferential to the will of the body as expressed by a majority. And that's why you can, people smarter than me have figured out a precedent for how you can do it by majority rule vote. But Russ is absolutely right. They could change the rules on Monday and pass this bill if they wanted to. But right now, they don't have the votes.
Hi. Can you discuss what the criteria is for a constitutional amendment, how it would get through? Because we rarely hear it, and this is why I ask. We talked about the Supreme Court this week. Whatever the ruling is going to tear this country apart. And many people, maybe a supermajority in our country, would support term limits on the Supreme Court instead of this lifetime appointment. Would that be feasible? Can it go through the Congress? And what is the criteria?
So a constitutional amendment is set at a supermajority threshold for passage in the Senate by the Constitution. And so that's something that you couldn't change without a constitutional amendment. The reason you can change the filibuster is because it's not in the Constitution and it's a sort of lower tier rule, and for all the reasons we discussed. And then, of course, once you pass it, it has to be ratified by 3/5 of the states. So it is a very uphill climb to pass a constitutional amendment, and there is no real way to change those requirements that would not also involve a constitutional amendment. The good news, though, I'd want to double check this, but I do think that term limits governing the Supreme Court could be passed as a piece of regular legislation.
It's very disputed, but there's a growing group of people that are trying to argue that. The
Yes.
general view is that it requires constitutional amendment, but I think there's a good argument that you don't have to do that.
We have a former chair of the Judiciary Committee.
Well, it's
here.
coming up a lot now because,
Yeah, I mean, so this is, and the same goes for the size of the court. If you wanted to, the reason that we're at 9 now is that's just where, the ball was when we stopped changing the number of Supreme Court justices. But I'm sure it would face legal challenges. But if you had 50 votes to reform the filibuster and you had 50 votes for a piece of legislation setting term limits for the Supreme Court, you could pass it into law and then try to withhold, to stand up against the legal challenges.
This will be the final question of the afternoon, everybody. Final question. Can I see hands, please? Awesome. Thank you. We'll go right here.
So I know none of you guys can tell the future, but I'm curious about the path forward on filibuster reform, especially since it seems hard to imagine Democrats winning huge majorities in the Senate to really get to the point where they could comfortably do that.
Yeah, so, as it stands right now, it seems like Democrats need a majority of 52 votes to get filibuster reform, assuming Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema hold their positions, which, is probably a safe assumption. So, they could pick up 2 additional seats this cycle. There's a pickup opportunity in Wisconsin. There's a pickup opportunity in Pennsylvania. They would have to win both those races and not lose any other seats. Democrats are facing a very challenging political environment that would make that very hard to do. I think they could win in Wisconsin. I think they can win in Pennsylvania. But to win both those seats and not lose anywhere else is sort of drawing an inside straight, which could happen. And things are, anybody who predicts the future in this political environment, is just making a prediction. But I think that the next time that either party controls all 3 branches of elected government, the filibuster will go away, whether that's Democrats or Republicans. So if you take the optimistic view, and the good thing is you don't need the House. So if you take an optimistic view and you hope that this cycle is a little bit like 2010 where Democrats did better in the Senate than the House, we've drawn inside straight, we add 2 seats in the Senate. Even if we lose the House, we could get rid of the filibuster. If you take the pessimistic view and you think that Republicans are going to be back in power and potentially hold all 3 branches of elected government after 2024, then they're going to get rid of the filibuster. And I think the proof of that, is that they did it already. They got rid of it in 2017 for Supreme Court justices. McConnell was ready to do it in 2005. I put very little stock in all of the rhetoric about not doing it now. And I think their base will just demand it, and they will have no other choice. So I think the future of the filibuster is the next time either party has unified control of all 3 branches, it's going to be gone.
Adam, great comments. This is actually is a fun book to read. I strongly recommend it.
Thank you, Russ. Thank you.